Okay, this is Devin Doherty, and we are going over a purchase agreement. The first document, and anytime you see the word disclosure, that just means that's something you need to know. In this case, there's a seller's agent, that's an agent representing the seller, and then there's a buyer's agent, and that's the agent that's representing the buyer. And then there's also the potential for a dual agent. And as you read the details of this, there's a fiduciary responsibility that each party has. And if we're writing up an offer for you, then that means most likely we're representing you as a buyer exclusively, or our team is representing you as a buyer while you're writing on one of our listings. So we have a fiduciary responsibility to use the utmost care, and that's all spelled out here. A duty of honest and fair dealing and good faith. And the bottom line is that from an honesty integrity perspective, you can look at our Yelp reviews. You can just kind of figure out who we are and how it is that we show up, and we're glad to serve you through this entire process. You're going to find that the Civil Code section 20719.13 through 207.9.24 is required reading. It's good pillow talk, and the gist of it is it's a rehashing of the page before. Remember, disclosure just means it's something you need to know. Next document is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Same thing, there could be multiple buyers vying for the same property. If that is the case, there's a specific information you need to know. Same thing with multiple sellers represented by one broker. And then the same thing in dual agency, you're going to find that there's information here for you on that. Then the next document has to do with wire fraud. The key here is just to read this right here, which basically says do not ever wire or electronically transfer funds prior to calling to confirm the transfer instructions. What's been happening in the industry is that there's been hackers that are attacking real estate agents' accounts and escrow accounts, and so only use a phone number when that you were provided previously for contacting escrow, and they will confirm verbally your wiring instructions. That's to send your deposit money and to send the balance, whether that is your the balance that you need to pay if you're getting a loan, or the balance you're paying in cash. And that goes directly to here. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. Then we're going to go into the purchase contract itself. I'm giving you just a generic overview of the purchase contract so you're clear. The contract is always related to a specific property and a specific dollar amount, and then it's a specific timeline. What we find is that sellers, if we're making a deal with sellers, then we need to find something that's good for them and that's also good for the buyer, and we basically have to create a win-win. So in this case, what we're looking to do is to create a price and a timeline that's effective for both parties. In that, there's going to be confirmation of the brokerages. There's the seller's brokerage firm and the buyer's brokerage firm. And then what's going to happen is that there's going to be an initial deposit. The initial deposit in the amount of normally 3% of the purchase price would be customary and normal. It could also be less than that in the case of a VA loan, but most times it's at least 3% of the purchase price, and the default language is set for the wire transfer. In some cases, there can be an all-cash offer placed. About 30% of all transactions in Orange County, California, are currently cash offers. So many times, finance buyers are competing with cash buyers for the same property. The loan amount will be placed here in this item D1, where you'll have the loan amount and then the type of loan that you're getting. And then if there's a second loan, if it's what's called an 80-10-10, it's possible you could have a first and a second with putting 10% down. Then on the next page here, you're going to have verification of funds. Generally, this is provided before the offer is submitted. There are cases where we might submit an offer prior to verification of funds. Appraisal contingency is an important one. There are three major contingencies. There's the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, and the inspection contingency. In this case, the appraisal contingency default language is 17 days. Many times, if we're representing buyers, we'll talk to the buyer about waiving their appraisal contingency depending on the situation in the market and the level of competition. On the loan contingency, when you're working with one of our preferred lenders, many times the loan contingency can also be waived because our lender has prepared you with a fully underwritten approval, so there's no need for a loan contingency. You already know you have a loan. In the case of needing a loan contingency, this is also a negotiable item. There are additional addendums and attachments that can be provided. We're not going to go over anything specific on this document, but if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. As far as allocation of costs, basically what you've got is Section 7 is where all the costs get separated, and I'm going to speak to what's normal and customary in a transaction that is in the 80th percentile. 80% of the time, it's going to be something similar to what we're talking about, where in this case the seller would pay for a natural hazard disclosure report. That's going to tell the buyer about fire, flood, and earthquake. It's also going to talk about tax and environmental if these boxes are checked. The seller may also pay for a termite inspection. That would be customary and normal, and the buyer would pay for a physical inspection. That's what those documents are for. What's customary and normal is that the seller would pay for the installation of smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. What's also customary and normal is that the seller would also normally pay for any cost of compliance under any other minimum mandatory government inspections. In Orange County, California, there are none of those specific things. So you'll find that those boxes are normally checked. On escrow and title in Section C, 7C, that is normally a shared expense. Buyer pay half, seller pay half. Generally speaking, sellers generally control where escrow is done. Buyers can request it, but 9 out of 10 times the seller is going to mandate where they want the escrow completed. Title, the seller is going to pay for their portion of the title. The buyer is going to pay for their portion of the title. What's customary and normal is that sellers usually will pay for county and city and HOA transfer fees. They'll also pay for the doc prep fee. Sellers will normally also pay for the home warranty. Buyers may pay for any private transfer fees. For instance, we have cities in Irvine, Ladera Ranch, Lake Forest, where there's private transfer fees, and sometimes the buyer is required to pay for those fees. This isn't section here. Section 8 is where the items that are included and excluded. So if there's a stove in the property, which most likely there is, that would be checked. If there's fridges and washers and dryers that have not been excluded by the seller, that can be requested by the buyer in that section. There's also other items that would be considered included or excluded, but you can read specifically here what is normally included or excluded. Next section, Section 9, talks about whether the property is going to be occupied and how it's going to be occupied, and when the property is going to be delivered vacant. What's customary and normal is that it's delivered vacant at 6 p.m. on the close of the date of escrow. Sometimes we will negotiate with sellers for representing buyers to give them a short-term lease back, and that's what this Section C is about. The ability to leave the seller in possession in a non-vacant situation, to give the seller some flexibility to move out. As we move through some of the other standard language, this contract is used over 6,000 times per month just in the county of Orange. So this is all standard boilerplate language. Literally hundreds of thousands of transactions per year are using all this boilerplate language. Section F talks about how much time the seller has to get condo disclosures out. That can all be modified. Condition of the property, buyer's investigation, all standard boilerplate language. I'm going to get down to time periods, Section 14. Seller normally would have 7 days after acceptance to provide all the reports, and the buyer would normally have 17 days to do their inspection contingency. So just to recap, inspection is the third, appraisal and loan would be the other two. So the buyer has 3 reasons to protect their money. It's appraisal, loan, and inspection. So those are all built into this process, and your money is always going to be protected in California. There's no automatic release of contingencies in California. A buyer must sign a document called a CR, which stands for contingency release. You can see right here, form CR is being referred to here. As we go through the rest of the document, you'll find it's all boilerplate language. Glad to answer any additional questions for you on that. As we get down to Section 21, 95 to 99% of all transactions finish with liquidated damages signed. That means that neither party, seller or buyer, can litigate if it came down to it for more than 3% of the purchase price. So that means that if there's a 3% deposit, that's why that number is so important to the seller, then only the seller or the buyer can argue over that amount. But the money being released from escrow requires a mutual decision by both buyer and seller. Anytime there's only a unilateral decision, it must be overruled by mediation, arbitration, or litigation. And built into the California purchase contract is a mediation provision. So all parties that enter a California purchase process must enter in a mediation, and then there's an arbitration provision. The only time I see this not being signed is by attorneys who are in transactions who may or may not want to arbitrate. But again, 95+% of the time, the arbitration provision is signed. Beyond that, you've got some other language in here about, again, all boilerplate, and then you have the expiration of the offer. Sometimes what happens is that if a buyer wants to write multiple offers on different properties, they might want to write one and then revoke that offer within, let's say, a 24-hour period. That could be changed here. Standard language is 3 days, and that's really the basis of a residential purchase agreement. And then, of course, buyers sign, agents sign, and then there's an inspection advisory. The gist of the inspection advisory is simply buyer beware, buyer beware, buyer beware. The point is that it's the buyer's responsibility to check out everything that is on this list, and we as agents are glad to support the pathway of doing that. And as a former general contractor, and as a person who's helped literally hundreds and hundreds of people buy homes, we're glad to walk you through every single detail. So that should give you a brief rundown of the purchase contract, and feel free to let us know if you have any questions. Thanks so much.